vamos dar continuidade ao nosso evento. Agora o professor Martin Rieser vai se apresentar.
I've been working with digital art for something approaching 30 years. And a lot of what we've been looking at and discussing, I have made projects in that territory. I also a writer, and I have published 2 books on digital culture. New Screen Media, which was quite an important book mapping out the territory in interactive work in the 90s coming into the 2000s. And more recently, this book looking at the impact of mobile technology on audience, and particularly in art projects. But what I want to talk about is the notion of the uncanny. Many of you will have heard of the uncanny valley, which is this hypothesis that when a facsimile of a human, a representation of a human, gets close to the physical perfection of the human, but not quite close enough, we get this strange feeling of disgust. And here is a little graph which shows the kind of experiences that lead to that uncanny valley. And this has been a problem with computer representations of the human. So we can accept stuffed animals, robots, and so on, because we know what they are. But as they begin to resemble the human very closely, we get this feeling of uncanny, eerie, strange. And this professor in Japan, Masahiro Mori, created a facsimile of himself, a representation of himself that animated to test out people's reactions. And so this doppelganger, we call it, this double, could talk and react to humans like the real professor. And he measured people's responses. But I think it goes wider than this, because Freud had a lot to say about what he called the unheimlich, that is the uncanny in German. And here is a quote from an exhibition that was in Germany recently, talking about this reaction to the digital other, to the uncanny. And it's this idea of we project ourselves into media, and when these images of ourselves come back to meet us, we get this strange feeling. And they are uncanny because they are so close to the familiar. So it's the encounter with the familiar in an unfamiliar way that gives us this sensation. And what I would like to talk about is that with augmented reality, where representations of the human are beginning to be used a lot, we will encounter this more and more. And I would widen the debate to say that actually this encompasses the whole internet, social media, ways that we represent ourselves, and we become ghosts in the machine, and we stay there for many years, and we find ourselves, because Facebook never loses our traces. And so I think it is a wider condition, and one that as media artists and technologists we have to deal with. And I think the uncanny, here's a list of things that can be uncanny. Independent shadows, objects that can be confused with the living, interfaces that lead into but not out of real space, mirror images in which we no longer recognize ourselves, and of course last, the real doppelganger, the fragments which disclose our vulnerability. And Freud, in his famous essay, Das Unheimlich, in 1919, explored the origins of this word, and it comes from Heimlich, homely, the familiar. And it's really unheimlich is the negation of this condition. The secret things we have that are suddenly revealed to ourselves. And I think this is an important consideration with these technologies. And of course, the doppelganger or the double goes back through religion and history. And originally they were benign representations of the self. But later they became sinister, and in European literature they began to be a kind of herald of our death, and or a presentiment of disaster. And this sinister nature of the double is in Schubert's Der Doppelganger, which is a famous piece of music. And we can see this in other forms of literature. Jekyll and Hyde, the portrait of Dorian Gray, where the likeness is the same but different. And then in current media culture, we see this kind of uncanniness in the opera Coppelia, in the film Blade Runner, which deals with replicants, and in the Chucky films, where a doll becomes animated. And I think Kittler discusses this phenomenon, and that we are creating mechanized likenesses that roam the data banks that store our bodies. And I think this is quite an interesting thought. So I'm going to show you one of the forms of the digital uncanny. The Visible Human project in 1993 froze a human body, cut it very thin, and then scanned the pieces. And medical teams were able then to take a journey through the interior of the body and look at every organ. And so the human body became digitized and became this uncanny artifact. I actually did a project based on the Visible Human in 1996, a long time ago, where I used this uncanniness as part of the project. And I'll show you this. This was an interface into different collective representations of HIV. So people were able to post to this website, and you could interrogate each little square and reveal someone's understanding of HIV. And there were 4 different worlds where you could experience this. So this was 1996, and it was a long way ahead of what really we can do now on the internet. There are many artists working with this idea of the digital double. Wendy McMurdo is particularly important as a photographer who deals with this and creates these facsimiles within her photographs. And she did this piece called Olympia, where you see this head from the front with the camera, and then you gradually go around it and you realize it's a robot, but it's talking, and you get this sudden uncanny feeling. Other artists working in this way, Ken Feingold, you can see him in actually his replica head in the middle of these puppets, and all these puppets talk, and so does he, and he links the talk to the internet. And then, of course, we have Tony Orsler, who projects likenesses of the human that talk using video projection onto dolls, and we get this strange sensation when we meet them, particularly when they're distorted. But I'd like to talk about interactive narrative and the use of the other in my own work, but also how space relates to the body in all of my practice, I think. And one of the first projects that I want to talk about is understanding echo. This was done in 2000, and in it I took the Echo and Narcissus myth and reinvented it. And you can see on this diagram that there are zones of interaction. And as you get closer to this pool of water, you interact with Echo, this nymph, in different ways. You become more and more intimate as you get closer to this figure. So this is in a circular pool of water, real water. and she speaks to you when you lean over.
Isn't jealousy the real problem? Or is it envy? The Bible says, what does it say? Something about the rebel angels. Were they envious? That's where it all started.
And so this figure rises in the pool, talks to you, and then disappears. And Echo, if you remember the myth, she's in love with Narcissus, and he does not return the love, and she pines away and becomes part of the landscape. And I think the figure of Echo is a kind of every woman. It explores this idea of the female, but you reconstruct the notion of her personality through all these fragments that you encounter. If I could get this to move on, I'll be very happy. Okay, so here she is in a different incarnation. You're not as close, you're closer to her, and she says something more intimate.
I recognized your face at a distance. Didn't we meet last year? I remember your face. So vividly. So clearly.
And so the image sorry, I'm using Keynote and it has its own way of moving. So these are the different video fragments that you link together to create your own image of this woman. And moving on, it will move on. I did another piece called Triple Echo, which took another myth, and this time I used the movement of the audience to move the poetry from one protagonist to another, spatially. So by moving your body through space, you were changing the discourse. I won't show you this because it takes too long. But basically you have 3 screens, and you are detected when you stand in front of one screen, you see one of the characters. When you move, their sound moves.
I see the way it is.
I see the way it is.
In the frozen green of your eyes.
In the frozen green of your eyes.
And you get a different interpretation of the
same
same
speech.
Synthesis, we once were.
When all the talk was breathless.
When all the talk was breathless.
A river flows to the
A river
utmost land.
flows to the utmost land.
But the audience
Loses its sinuous
only
past
hears
and the
one
seas
person
roaring.
at a time because you have a speaker over the
We have so
over
little
the
in
screen.
common.
We're hearing all 3 at once. Now, in terms of physical interaction with space, this was a very simple project. It was in a hotel room in Milan. It was commissioned as part of a project for in video. And what happened was the door on the left is virtual and the door on the right is real. And you interrupt an argument by
Morning,
2
love.
people.
Morning.
Big day at last.
I know, I'm dead nervous.
Ah, you'll save it.
I'm not so sure. Where are my notes?
In your bag.
So you get this voyeuristic glimpse into their world. When you walk out of the room, the door shuts,
I'm bound to fluff
and when
it.
someone else
He
comes
just-
in, the door opens. So every
like
time
crap.
someone walks out or walks in,
Not surprising
you
that
get
you
another view
It was a
into
good wine.
this room.
A very good one.
So a very simple spatial arrangement, but it was very
Like this
compelling,
room.
and people came
It
in
holds a
and
few
out,
memories.
and they would be leaving, and then they would see that another video was starting, and they would come back in. So it was a way of projecting intimate space into the audience. And I think this idea of the liminal is really important in this understanding of space and the body. And liminality is a space between two spaces. It's used in ritual as a place of entry into another space. And I think this project exemplifies that. It is about entering a different world through this liminal space. This project was done in Bath, which is a city in the south of England, and the cathedral in Bath has these ladders on the front in stone of the angels ascending and descending, which is like Jacob's dream. I was inspired by this to make the project, and inside the cathedral we had 5 huge screens on which these avatars were projected. We used a technology that was similar to Kel's, which was ultrasound transmission and triangulation. And so these little chirpers emitted a high frequency sound that you cannot hear, but you could use microphones to measure people's positions in space. And we use miniature computers on the screens to calculate. So here you see the setup in the cathedral, 5 screens. On the end screen are representations of the angels on the ladders. And then when someone stands in front of a screen, a unique avatar comes to them out of space and talks to them in enigmatic language. So here are the ladders. And so these hosts, they may be angels, they may be spirits, they may be the dead within the cathedral. And after I did this project, they took up the floor and they found 27,000 people buried in the cathedral. So it's full of these presences. And so if this will move on for me. And here we had the same headsets as you're using, wireless headsets, and you created your own music as you walked around the cathedral. So everybody's trajectory around the cathedral created their own sound path, a cappella singing. And I won't dwell on the setup, but it was complicated for each of the screens. And on the screen would appear your avatar who would follow you from every screen to every screen. So like the sound in triple echo. These figures would come out of the darkness and talk to you. And because it was in a cathedral, we had to have that through the earphones.
Find
Anyone else looking would see text here that would appear to illustrate what they were saying.
Motion is an illusion. Many feed the few. Difference defines surprise. To leave is to arrive.
And of course, these are ambiguous statements, and people could interpret them in whatever way they wanted. And there were several hundred of these spoken by the avatars. It was around then that I began to work with locative and pervasive media. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about the territory of the locative. Whoops. First of all, our sense of ourselves is quite important. And this little homunculus illustrates how the senses on the body, particularly touch, are important to the brain in proportion. So because we have many nerve endings in the hand and in the lips, they are exaggerated in this image. I think this is a very polite image, by the way, because it doesn't deal with parts below. But I think the subjectivity of our senses is important, because once you place your sensorium into the mobile device, the same hierarchy applies. And one of the senses that we don't really deal with very well is proprioception, this sense of the body in space that all dancers are aware of. But without this sense of where your limbs are, how you are standing, you cannot stand up, you cannot walk. So it's an important sense, and I'd be very interested to see more work being done with mobiles taking account of this sense. And locative art is not new. I think we have to be clear that there's a lot of ambulant practice over the last few decades that doesn't use technology. Work by Richard Long, Robert Smithson, Hamish Fulton, Victor Coney and Sophie Calle, for example. And actually it goes back much further. It goes back to ancient cultures, to the rituals of pilgrimage, to Aboriginal songlines, and so on. And I think one of the things that interests me is, can we root our artistic practice into the resonance of those embedded forms that already are kind of hardwired into our unconscious? And I think we need to look again at how art and locative media are used. It should not just be a progress of mapping. So I'm going to look at a few projects that I've done with locative media, where the body in space is an important part of the practice. And I did this project, The Third Woman, with a group of European artists. It was funded from many sources, but it was the first interactive film on mobile surfaces. And it was actually a hybrid performance, and it changed over many iterations. And I think the methodology we used was an interesting one. So it was based on The Third Man, a famous English film made in Vienna after the war, and we rewrote the film and we refilmed it in Vienna. And at that time, the QR code was just emerging. This is 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. And we set up some tests in the U-Bahn, the underground in Vienna. And we also wanted to incorporate the QR code on the body. So we had animateurs walking around in QR fashions to interact with the audience. And we also did sound installations where we had a group sweeping the U-Bahn for radiation from electronic devices. And we got a lot of people very worried. This made a particularly horrible noise. And we did a performance in the Kunsthalle, which is an avant-garde art venue. But what was interesting about this project is we anticipated sensing of heart rate and skin impedance that is just emerging with the smartwatch. And we wrote the project to have 3 versions of every scene, and the emotional tone that was coming from your body would determine the progress of the narrative. So you would get a different version of the scene. If you were very upset or if you were very calm, you would get a different version. And the idea was we would create a kind of emotional cinema. So we're still hoping that when the devices are there, we can do this. It went to Greece, Biennale. We also had large screens that you could interact with wirelessly. And it had a kind of game you could play where you scanned QR codes and moved on to the next scene in the film. And all the environment was hung with graphic objects that related to the story, such as the passport of one of the characters or a police warning. And we played this in Bath and in China. And every time we did it, it was different. And there was a strong performance element. For example, we were in a hall with 2,000 people. And part of the plot is that people have had a disease that has come from a bioproduct that was carelessly used on the black market. And here is someone who was contaminated. So the students went in, arrested him, and carried him out of the hall in front of 2,000 very surprised Chinese. We did it in New York, here in Galapagos, which is an avant-garde arts venue. And here we used the fashion element much more. And we got the audience to create their own version of the film on their smartphone. And then we brought all the versions together on the big screen. It was the version that everyone in the audience had the most preference for. But we did a kind of cyber fashion show at the beginning. And then the models would circulate and they would scan the QR codes, and then we asked questions that would give the emotional tone of where the next scene would come from. I'm not going to show you all this because I won't have time, but this is online if you want to see it. And there is a website for The Third Woman that documents all this. I'll just show you one scene from the film, which we shot in the same style as the Third Woman. And here the protagonist is female. Her friend has supposedly died, and she's going to find out from the boyfriend of the friend, who is an actor, what might have happened. So this is shot as a film noir on location in Vienna, and we filmed in the sewers, we filmed everywhere that the Third Man original film was made.
I was a friend of Lara's. You were also a good friend, weren't you?
I was her closest friend.
I saw you at her grave. Were you in love?
I don't know anything. Except I want to be dead too.
Can I ask you, how do you know Roscoe?
He brought me some money.
Why?
He wanted me to leave town and keep quiet.
Quiet?
Had the third woman in the U-Bahn.
The who?
I was there. I didn't see her face.
Another project that was done with Locative Media, Riverains, was performed in London, and we invented a piece of software for this called Empedia, and we did tests on locative sensing along Shoreditch High Street, which is in the East End of London and has a very deep history, a history that includes Shakespeare, Jack the Ripper, the suffragettes, immigration, and a number of stories were created as video fragments that you could experience as you walked along this street. And we could use QR codes and we could use layer, which is augmented reality. And we put these stickers on the buildings for people who didn't have the augmented reality software. And each one would trigger a story. Here's a fragment using some archival images about Jews in the East End. Whoops, go back. Maybe it will just play. It's there. Has a mind. Okay, I'll leave that. But it's this rich video histories coming back to people as they walk the streets. After that, I was asked to do one about Asians who had left Uganda and come to Leicester and had lived for 40 years in Leicester. And it was to celebrate that culture, but also there were 2,000 interviews that we put into this locative audio project. And it was represented in an arts centre by this multiple screen that you could interact with your mobile phone. You could also use the wall image to navigate, or you could go out and walk the trail. And this is what it looked like. This was based on Ugandan textiles, so each one had an audio track that was also illustrated by video. And it was shown in various places, including Australia.
If there was ever a perfect world, that was it. The weather, the temperatures, the community spirit.
I was born in Kakira, which is a small village near Jinja.
So these are different voices about what life was like in Uganda before they were expelled by Idi Amin.
Entirely run by Madhwani Sugar Works. The village people.
Now we are looking away from QR codes to this new object called the aesthetic code, which was invented in Nottingham by the mixed reality lab there. And it means that you can embed a code within an image seamlessly, and it's not detectable by the eye. It's algorithmic, so if you have a closed object with a certain number of marks inside it, it doesn't matter where the marks are, that will be part of a URL. So you can use this to create aesthetic codes that cannot be detected by the human eye, but can be detected by the phone. And I think we're all rather tired of the QR code as an image. It's not a beautiful image. So we're doing projects using this now. And I want to now just move on to augmented reality in proper and work that we've been doing in this area. So spatial narrative, we did work in Leicester when I was working there. We recreated the whole of Leicester when it was a Roman city in augmented reality. And as you walked around the city, you could see the original Roman buildings on top of what is there now. You could go to different points on a map to retrieve objects, and those objects you could look at spatially, manipulate, examine them as though they were real three-dimensional artifacts. And this is all on YouTube, by the way, if you want to look at it. And we did all the interiors of the buildings as well. So as a kind of historical project using augmented reality, it was quite interesting. We also created Roman characters who behaved with some AI in them. Of course, we originally wanted to have many citizens to see if emergent behaviors would occur. but we hadn't got a computer powerful enough to make this happen. So this one figure is as far as we got. But we did research the music, the food, all the cultural artifacts of the time. And then it was also made into an app, so you could explore Roman Leicester. Another project that was about physical immersion in the environment that I took part in was Ocean of Light by a group called Squid Soup, where these multiple lights could be controlled by computer to create images in 3 dimensions made of light. There are actually thousands of lights, but they're all computer controlled, and you can get a volumetric display in full color. But obviously, technically, enormous amounts of wiring and controls. This has been shown around the world. And what I wanted to do with this project was create this avatar within the grid of the lights, which would be called the prisoner. And the prisoner would have 36 different emotional states enacted through dance movement. And you would control the avatar by your voice, and by the pitch and tone of your voice, it would behave differently. So if you were kind to the figure, it would behave in one way, and if you were aggressive, it would behave in another. And this was the avatar we created. About 3 years ago, I started on this project called Secret Garden, and this was really a performance piece working with augmented reality and artificial sonography. And it was based on the Garden of Eden story, so the fall in religious terms. And I've been collaborating with a composer, Andrew Hugill, and this was inspired by the illustrations to Paradise Lost by Milton that were done by a British artist in the 19th century. And it centered on 11 spiritual states that come out of the Zephirot, which is an ancient Jewish image. And so I wrote the libretto for this, and there are 11 different scenes with this libretto. And Andrew wrote the music. What it was a circle or a horseshoe of iPads, mounted iPads. And as someone began to use one iPad, you would get one sound channel. If someone used another one, you get a second sound channel, and all the sound channels blended into a full symphonic composition. So it was about augmenting the sound as well as the augmented reality. So they were on a very simple scale, so they would all blend.
Okay,
we
Compassion,
had to
take one.
Use dancers for the avatars, and we did our own motion capture in the studios in Leicester. I directed the dance as well. And then we created in Maya these figures that you could interact with in 3 dimensions on the iPads. We also did the scenography in Unity and then combined the two. So this is the sort of first step of attaching the movement of the dots to a frame, and then we had to attach the frame to a better replicant of the human form. So this was shown in Leicester, but it was also shown in Taiwan, and actually had a huge audience there. So here you can see someone using the system with earphones, because we have all these sound channels. And when the figure appears on the screen, if you move the perspective of the scene moves with your movement. So it tracks your face and changes the perspective on the screen. And so as people accumulate, you get more and more. So shown in Taipei, we had 47,000 people come to see it, which is quite an audience. And the setup there was fairly similar, like this. And we are going to make a locative version of this that works out in the real world. And I'll just show you a clip. Obviously no perspective here, but you get an idea. And the last piece I want to show to you is an extension of this idea of the digital opera, an opera that is created in the native affordances of the medium, not just augmenting. Here's just another example. Obviously, on the kind of budgets we had, we would prefer to do the whole project again with better animation, but it's cost and time, and so we are now bidding for larger bids to do this sort of thing. The last piece I did, RUR, was done this autumn. It was a commission from Sussex University, and it's based on an old play from Czechoslovakia, which imagines a future where robots replace humans. And I changed the script to deal with the idea of the human replicant, that is, the facsimile of the human grown from biological sources, but from a different kind of biology. And it exists as a website where social media is the medium. So the opera, in fact, is a number of social media streams that come together in a WordPress wall. We filmed this again in green screen because we wanted to have scenography that we could drop behind the singers. And so it was less about avatars at this stage than about exploring how social media could be used to compose an opera. Here is a scene from Capek's 1920s play, which you could see was very melodramatic, but looking far ahead of its time. And the word robot, which we use all the time, was derived from this play. It was invented by Capek. So here is the opera space, and here we can see the YouTube clips that compose the core of the opera. And when you click on one of the icons above, you can change the stream. So here we have Facebook There's a page on Facebook that actually pretends to be a replicant company. So we created all these false identities online of a company. Also, we have tweets from the future, so the replicants themselves keep trying to warn the humans of the consequences of their technology, and they tweet from the future. So here we have on Pinterest, you have adverts for these replicant soldiers that the company is producing that ultimately will destroy all humans. So the various problematics with this new form of native opera or hybrid performance or whatever you want to call it. One is the reception. Who is the audience for this? The second is, can you achieve real immersion like you have in the opera house? And the third, how do you distribute? Where do you get the money for this? So these are real problems. And what are the native affordances of that you can use in this new world? What are the natural grammars for the nonlinear storytelling? How do you deal with this idea of a story space that is larger than the material, that is contains all these fragments, where the audience have to do the work to join the fragments together? And can you work with parallel worlds like we did with the future and the past and the present all being co-present? And can the audience be a collaborator in these kind of projects? So these were the research questions, really. And then we have these problems of immersion. And what we are going to do next is to make an augmented reality version of the opera using avatars for the replicants, because the fit is perfect. So we can make the humans human, and the replicants can be avatars that are digital. And let's see how those two worlds can work together. So I won't talk too much about this. This is the music set to video. So this is one of the video clips. And this is a chorus by the replicants.
Machines that die. Faces all the same. Faces filled with blame.
And I'll move on and show you another one before we run out of time. So this is a replicant, and she is singing the blues of being a slave, really, in human terms.
I am just a replicant, living on my own, writing all the emails, answering the phone. Every day is different.
So there are various things about the musical perspective. Creating an opera that comes straight from the digital world. And so what is lost by this process and what is gained? And how can it change the way we produce? And the immersion is one of the biggest problems. How do you create that? And we're hoping that using augmented reality will bring that back into the process. So this is the URL for the opera, if you want to look at it. And there are some other links here for the research that I've been engaged in. I hope that we have now time for questions. I'm trying to keep to time, so I said I would talk till 2:30, and it is now 2:30. We have a quarter of an hour to maybe have a discussion rather than just questions, because I would rather have an interplay with the audience. So, obrigado.
Alguém gostaria de colocar uma questão para o professor Martin?
É uma pergunta relativa à experiência de se tratar de uma... Bom, seus trabalhos eles parecem sempre tratar de uma narrativa, de uma história, mas no decorrer de outros aparatos ou de outro tipo de experiência, por exemplo, se a gente comparar com a experiência cinematográfica ou televisiva. Então, uma pergunta relativa à criação desse tipo de narrativa ou de pensamento fílmico, assim, no sentido da experiência, a partir de um ambiente que é completamente livre e sem esse controle ou esse tipo de previsão do interator. Inclusive, no sentido, teve uma obra que você mostrou que a experiência se dá por QR codes, uma mais antiga. Por mais que ele se amplie para outro lugar, você ainda tem uma experiência muito dura ali do papel na parede, do ambiente também que o deslocamento desses QRs foram pensados. Então, eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho de como está essa pesquisa nesse sentido de pensar nesse lugar da experiência como fruição da obra.
Yes, I think this idea of flow in narrative is very important, and what is really important is this sense of immersion in the narrative, because the moment you break the diegesis of the space and people become conscious of the technology, you have lost your audience. So the idea is to have compelling content that people want to see more of. I think too many times I've seen media art pieces where once you've understood how the technology works, there is nothing left to explore. You know, there is no other experience. And I think if media art is going to be as important as other art forms, it has to deal with the human condition. And I still, maybe it's old-fashioned, but I think we can make new narratives in this medium. And yes, they're fragmentary, and yes, the audience has to work hard. The audience has to put together many pieces to make, to form the sense of what is going on. But I don't think that is any different to looking at and reading a painting or any other artwork where what is there is not given easily, where you have to work to get meaning, you have to work to gain experience of what is embedded. So I don't apologize for the difficulties. I think that is important, that people are motivated to win meaning from an artwork.
Hay una sección que mostró del mapping, la subjetividad en mapping. Creo que esa idea es interesante para la inmersión. Algunas obras, por ejemplo, como las de Robert Smithson, que hace una inmersión en términos más biológicos, donde, por ejemplo, en algunos paisajes que él hizo, después fueron asumidos, fueron inmersivos en el sentido de especies biológicas, cuando hacía estas especies o estos paisajes alrededor de la playa o cerca a la playa, aparecía una idea importante. La pregunta que tengo es si a través de un mapping hecho con el celular o con computación se puede hacer una ampliación, una inmersión, una imagen 4D alrededor de estas obras.
Yes, in 4D, which I presume includes sound and time. But yeah, I think the map has become a very important object in all mobile media, and yet it is a map that is distorted. It's a Google map. It usually has priorities that are not our priorities, and the map as it exists is not the way we look at space. We look at space as nodes of importance in our lives. We navigate by the shops on the street corners or by the tower in the distance that we know. We don't navigate, except in an app, by the actual map. And so I think what I would like to do is to abandon the map as an interface. I think it is a very poor interface for art, and it does not reflect the way we see the world. And I think at the moment, audio is a better medium for locative media than visual media. I'm hoping that with things like Google Glass and Oculus Rift, if they can be miniaturized or made discrete, that we can engage people in this four-dimensional world, this environment out there, where the augmented narratives are related to the world we are in. That is, that there is a correspondence between the physical space and the imaginative space, and that we use that correspondence. So I think it is very important that when we did River Rains in London, we were walking on the very street that Shakespeare had a theatre, where Jack the Ripper had killed women, and that historical depth helped to make the augmented experience have more resonance. So I do think the alignment of real space and virtual space is very important, and I'm not very interested in projects that displace experience from the real world entirely. And we have many examples of that process in locative gaming, where it doesn't matter which city you are in, you can play the game, and the geography is of no importance. So I think we do have to have respect for our environment and its historical and emotional and human meanings.
Alguém mais?
Eu percebo que em muitos trabalhos você tem uma preocupação com trazer a realidade aumentada ou um sentido de imersão. Gostaria de saber se você já teve experiência ou se você já teve interesse de procurar utilizar capacetes de realidade virtual.
I'm not getting anything.
I can ask in English?
Could you ask in English?
Okay. Yeah. I see that many of your works is trying to work with augmented reality. And I would like to ask if you ever tried to use cave technology or headsets or something kind of.
In the next project, we will use Oculus Rift, but my experience of cave is not a good one. I have been sick in caves, and I think the early versions of virtual reality were not adjusted to human perception, and they were really unpleasant, especially if there was a lot of movement. So I've kind of avoided that, simply because of what it does to you, makes you feel physically. Cave environments, I think, are old-fashioned now, and we can do better. So I'm much more interested in how you bring scenography and characterization into a virtual space that augments the real world and where part of the scenery is the real world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because I see many of your works are inside telas, né? Screens.
Yeah.
You have many screens, and I think about what's the immersion you can have just with the screens.
I think what you find is that the sound is the most immersive property, and that the visual follows the sound rather than the other way around. And at the moment, the technologies we have are screen-based. It's very hard to break away from those. If I had the money, I would have projected all the hosts in Bath Abbey on smoke, so that they were more ethereal. But you know, with these projects, they are research projects for a university, really. They're not commercial projects that are well-funded. And if you think The Third Woman was 1.5 hours film made on location, and it cost 25,000 euros, okay? So that is a tiny budget. We saw a film in the Biennale that cost 1 million euros, and I think they wasted 1 million euros. But you can have a lot of money and not make anything interesting.
That's true.
Na verdade, acho que a Rosângela que pediu para perguntar, eu estou intermediando a pergunta. A gente gostaria de saber, em projetos como aquele Third Woman que você mostrou, qual o seu papel ali? Porque existe um filme e uma série de ações. Então, eu queria saber se essas ações são pensadas com o grupo, ou se você tem algum papel ali mais atuante, tem alguma ação que você... acho que era essa a questão da professora Rosângela. Se entendemos bem, acho que era isso.
Okay.
Obrigada.
Okay, well, usually it's collaborative working, but, you know, if I have the idea and I write the script, and I do the directing of the actual actors, and also have an overview of how everything is put together. But it is by consent with the collaboration. There were 8 artists working on this project, and we have an expression in English called herding cats. You know, when you try to put cats like sheep, this is very difficult. And you all know how artists think, so I have much experience of egos that are in conflict, and this is what happens in these projects. And so you are in the role of mediator as well as director, I think. And for it to be truly collaborative, you have to give people space for their own ideas, and those have to be embodied in the work, and they were.
And this will be in English, yes?
All right.
So you started the presentation with a discussion of the uncanny and the uncanny valley, the association or disassociation between the human and the replica.
Yes.
And then you showed this long trail of works. Maybe you could tell us something about how you differentiate on the uncanny valley after all these experiments.
Okay, I showed you a history, if you like, of how I got to where we're exploring the use of the other and the avatar within the work. And I think if you reflect on it, ECHO and HOST and several of the other projects are about the digital other, this meeting with some kind of aspect of ourselves that has been hidden and comes forward into the light. So I think that is the connection with those projects, if you like. But the other part of the question is augmented reality in the body, and how the body in space can change the way we consume media. And so all the work I've shown you, to some extent, is spatialized and depends on the audience position for the interaction, whether it's your location geographically, or your position within a space of installation. So I think that there are those two aspects I was talking about. One is the digital other, and the shock when we recognize this lost part of ourselves, if you like. And I think that is embedded in all the projects that I showed early on. And then there is this thing of the body in space and how it can interact with information. And that is true of locative media, and it is true of all the installation work that I've done. So those were the two connections, and I'm sorry if it wasn't more clear that the narrative was circling around those two issues.
Mais alguém? Agora a sua.
Agora é uma pergunta minha. Eu gostaria de saber se em alguns desses projetos... A pergunta agora é minha. Eu gostaria de saber se em alguns desses projetos, se existe um envolvimento, são trabalhos colaborativos que envolvem alunos, por exemplo, da graduação, mestrado, doutorado, porque essa é uma característica forte do nosso grupo de pesquisa aqui. Então, existem alguns trabalhos que nós realizamos, que envolvem desde alunos do primeiro ano até alunos que fazem pós-doutoramento. Então, e isso é uma característica que eu acho bastante interessante no nosso grupo. E eu gostaria de saber se vocês, em alguns desses trabalhos, se você tem alguma experiência nesse sentido, que envolva alunos de graduação também, e se existe esse tipo de colaboração com alunos. Obrigada.
Yes, for example, in the Secret Garden, the sound engineering and conception was done by a PhD student. The animation was done by an MA student. The motion capture was a collaboration with 3 different students assisting. I think this is a feature of most of the projects. You use the teams that you have available, and they learn through doing. And this is research through practice, which is very much our mode of research in the UK. And so we try to involve at least PhD or down to MA students in the development of such projects. And of course they gain from that and go on to do their own work at a higher level. In fact, the Taipei version of Secret Garden was entirely mounted by a PhD student. He took it to Taipei, set it up, and actually delivered a talk on behalf of myself. So, yes, this is normal practice in UK universities.
Então, agradecer ao professor Martin. Muito obrigado.